Oh, it is recording.
Recording?
Yeah, the problem is I'm still gonna have to do something with sharing.
You should just share the PDF in the chat.
Huh?
If you just share the PDF. Okay, so maybe we'll start while you're setting it up. And then,
Okay.
Hey, good morning. Shabbat Tov, everybody. So thank you for coming. B'shat Tova Mutzlachah. We are completing today volume 14. I'm not going to say we're finishing Hilchot Brachot because, as we've learned over the last few weeks, Hilchot Brachot are exceedingly complicated. We'll do what we can. We'll try and come out with something, with some conclusions. But finishing volume 14 of the Tzurba and Rabbanan Shir. I think probably over the next week or two, maybe we'll discuss halachot connected to Bein HaMetzarim and Tisha B'Av, and before taking a bit of a break over the summer. So that's just in terms of the schedule. Last week, we spoke a little bit, we began the halachot, we'll get to the book soon, don't worry. But we began the halachot of Ikar and Tafel, where you have two foods, a primary and a secondary food. And halakha is that one makes a bracha over the Ikar and not over the Tafel. One would say the bracha over that which is primary, which would then exempt. We'll see in a moment exactly how we understand it conceptually, but one would not be required to say bracha on the secondary food. So after you all left here thoroughly confused last week, I just want to maybe recap a little bit of what we said and just the principles, because as we saw, there are a number of complex cases that come up. So let's summarize it like this. There are two cases where it is absolutely clear that one food is going to be Ikar, one food is going to be Tafel, and only one bracha would be required. Right? A lot of where this gets complicated is that we have different types of food, maybe different mixtures, different things, where it's not clear to us that there is necessarily one Ikar and one Tafel. So do you say one bracha? Do you say two brachot? How does it work? But there are two cases where it seems to be clear that there is only one bracha recited over the Ikar. One case is the case we saw in the Gemara, whereby the two foods, although they're eaten separately, but one food is only eaten as a result of the other food which one had eaten. So the Gemara gives the example. It says one ate very salty food, very, very spicy food, and as a result of eating that food, one ate bread in order to in order to soften the taste of that food which one had eaten before. So one had no interest in eating bread in and of itself, not for its taste, not for its nutritional value, only because I ate the salty food and now my mouth is on fire or whatever it is, and I need to eat the bread. So there, the first food that one ate is the Ikar. The second food that one then ate is the Tafel, and one is only required to say a bracha over the Ikar and not over the Tafel. So maybe here let's actually go into the book. There's an interesting discussion which Shonim, the Achronim, have regarding this case.
Could you tell everybody that the link is in the chat?
Yes, the link is in the chat. For those that are following on Zoom, due to technical difficulties, you're not going to have it coming up on your screen, but in the chat there is a link to the PDF, and you can open that up and follow along in the book. So we'll begin on page, just to see on page 238, which is the Mishnah and the Gemara that we saw last week. Page 238, source number 2. You have the Mishnah and Brachot. It says, so somebody was brought salted food together with bread. One would only say the bracha over the salted food, that is the Ikar, that is primary, and the bread here is Tafel Shapat Tfelan. So this is the principle. Anytime you have two foods, one is primary and the other one is secondary, so the primary exempts the secondary food. Okay, we'll discuss that last week. So even though it's bread, as we mentioned last week, and the Gemara did say that bread is an unusual case, because normally we'd say bread, we'd say the bracha, and that would actually exempt everything else. By the way, I think it's the Magen Avraham, but there are those who understand the reason why when I have bread at the beginning of a meal and I say Hamatzi lechem min haaretz, and then I don't say any other brachot, there are those who understand that is based on this very principle of Ikar and Tafel, that the bread is considered, the Ikar is considered the primary, the mainstay of the meal, and therefore that exempts all other foods. But so over here, there's an interesting discussion. If you now skip to page 251, page 251, which says the conceptual underpinnings of the Tafel status. So the way Tosfot explained this Gemara was very interesting. That there, the Gemara said actually you had eaten, there were certain fruits, the fruits of Ginosar, which are very, very sweet. So the way the Gemara actually explained the Mishnah was that a person had first eaten these fruits, which were very sweet. And as a result of that, they then eaten the salty food, which was very salty. And as a result of eating that, they would then go and eat the bread. So Tosfot here asks a simple question, which is if really this was sort of a chain reaction of eating, that it began with the fruits, which were very sweet, and as a result of the fruits, one then ate the salty food, and as a result of that, one then ate the bread. So we would think that it's really the fruits themselves which one ate first, which are the Ikar, and then the salty food which came as a result, and the bread which came as a result of that. Both of them would be Tafel, meaning you should only have said the bracha on the fruits, not on the salty food in the first place. But the Mishnah said that the salty food here is primary. Yes, the salty food is primary in relation to the bread, but that is, you're only eating secondary as a result of the fruits. So Tosfot here in source number 25, he says, that's a Gemara which we've just seen. He says, Shamaliach Ikar, שהוא בא להשיב הלב שנחלש ובני מתיקות הפירות, והפת שלח רב תפל ואינו בא אליה בשביל המלך. In other words, a person is eating the salted food, which is the primary, in relation to the bread, and the bread which they then ate is tafel to that salty food. Now, ve'im tomar peirota ve'ikar malech tafel. But if you'll say, wait a minute, the salty food in the first place, that was tafel, that was secondary to these fruits. So you should have said the bracha on the fruits first, and then you not say any other bracha. So Tosfot gives two answers. Here's the second answer. He says, Yesh lomar, בשעה שאכל פירות גינוסר לא היה שם עדיין מליח, ופת, דלא היה יודע שיחלש ליבו מחמת המתיקות. He says, at the time when one was eating the fruits, one did not have in mind, one had no idea that they were going to eat the salty food afterwards, or the bread, meaning that wasn't there in the first place. I intended just to eat fruits. I ate the fruits. Now that I've eaten the fruits, oh, these are very, very sweet. You want the salty foods, you want the bread as well, as a result of that. And therefore, he says that the bracha that was originally on the fruits does not actually extend to the salty food that comes afterwards, which one had no idea that they would be eating it subsequently. So over the page, source 26, Chazon Ish as well says something similar. He says, "Ela perusho shatafel en tzarich bracha didei, ela tzarich ata birkat ha'ikar v'havei ata ha'ikar v'atafel birkotehem shavot." In other words, he says, what is underlying this concept of Ikar v'Tafel? It explains the Chazon Ish over here, based on Tosfot, that it's not that when I have these two foods, I don't say a bracha on the Tafel, that a person's not allowed to eat, a person's not allowed to get benefit from this world without saying a bracha. But when I have a primary and secondary, the bracha over the Ikar, that becomes the bracha over the Tafel as well. So in this case, the secondary food, even though normally, if it had been eaten by itself, it would have said a different bracha. In this case, the bracha that I've said on the Ikar extends over to the Tafel. So not that the Tafel, the secondary food, does not require a bracha. It requires a bracha, but that bracha is covered by the rules of brachot, by the bracha I've said on the primary food. So that's why he says, in the case where one's eating the salty food, and I know because of the salty food, I'm going to have to eat the bread. So fine. When I say the bracha of the salty food, that covers the bread as well in this case. However, if one ate the fruits and had no idea that these were not ordinary fruits, but these were perot ginosar, which were exceedingly sweet, and only after I've eaten them and said the bracha, now I realize I need more food, so then I'm going to have to say a new bracha on the salty food, and that's the account of that. That's the explanation of the Chazon Ish. In other words, that there is the Tafel still needs a bracha, but the bracha of the Ikar covers it. Yeah.
Examples. We go to a restaurant and order hummus.
Yes.
And sit there and that's the oil and everything else, and then they give you pizza with it. You're ordering the hummus, but you eat it with the pizza. So what's the tough that wants to be done?
Okay, so it's an interesting question. So the question is, if you go to, you just don't need to repeat the question. Okay, I'm repeating the question. So you get served the hummus, and then you're eating the pita because you want to. So the question was, what is the Ikar and what is the Tafel? Or would we consider it you're just eating the pita as a way in order to eat the hummus? So I think we'll get to this. The same question really extends not just to bread, but any types of mezonot. So long as the person is eating, there is a person gets a benefit, gets nutritional enjoyment from the fact that you eat the pita as well. Then we would say that then we would say that the bracha would be hamatzi. That would be in most cases. The Igrod Moshe over here in source 27 has a slightly different understanding, which is we can infer from his words, which is that not, as we've just said, that the Tafel requires a bracha, but that the bracha of the Ikar is the bracha it gets. He says no. He says when you have Ikar and Tafel, the Torah said that you need to say the bracha over the Ikar, and you don't need to say a bracha on the Tafel at all. It's not required. Okay, what would be the nafkamina? Because at the end of the day, practically speaking, we're both saying the same thing. Both are saying you say a bracha over the primary food, you don't say a bracha on the secondary food. But conceptually, we're saying why is that? Concept one is that the secondary food has had a bracha set over it, which is the bracha over the primary. Idea number two is to say no, that the secondary food doesn't have a bracha. So the example is this. Let's say a person was eating, like the case of the Mishnah, was eating salty fish and was eating bread, which in this case was tafel. The bread was only eaten to counteract the taste of the fish. Maybe the person doesn't even like bread, but why do they eat such salty fish in the first place? I don't know. But that's the case. So he says like this. Let's say the person ate the fish. You ate less than a kazayit of the fish, but you ate a kazayit or more of the bread. So when it comes to a bracha rishona, as we've learned several times, you on any amount that you eat, you would be required to say a bracha rishona, bracha before eating. When it comes to a bracha achrona, bracha after eating, that's only when one has eaten a certain quantity, that within a certain amount of time, that one would need to say the bracha achrona. So if one eats less than a kazayit, one does not say a bracha after eating. So when I ate less than a kazayit of the fish, of the salty food, which was the Ikar, right beforehand, the person only said shakol. They said shakol on this fish, they ate less than a kazayit of it, together with the fish, which was exceedingly salty. That's why they ate less than a kazayit of it, because it was too salty, they couldn't have any more. And then they ate the bread. So they didn't say a bracha before the bread, but they said they ate more than a kazayit. So now the question is, what is there going to be a bracha achrona? If we say, like we just understood, that really the secondary food is exempted of its bracha by the primary food, so then we'd say now, in the case of the bracha achrona, I can't say a bracha achrona over the borei nefashot, over the fish, because I didn't eat enough. But would I say birkat hamazon? So says Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, says no. He says, לעניות דעתי מסתבר שאין לברך ברכת המזון, נמצא שהוא כנפטר הטפל גם לעניין שלא יברך כלום. He says the secondary food is considered secondary, nullified to the extent that even though there's no bracha for now, that would be the din. Okay, so those are two different conceptual ways, perhaps, of looking at this idea of Ikar and Tafel, why it is that I don't say bracha on the secondary food. Okay, but so now zooming out again, just going back to the summary, what I started saying. So, okay, this is one case which is clear. This is the case of the Mishnah and the Gemara, where I have two foods which are eaten separately. But I know that I'm having these two foods. I eat food number one, which is my primary food. That's what I want to eat. And then as a result of that, in order to blunt the taste or whatever other reason, I eat the secondary food, which I was not interested in eating at all. But I'm only eating it as a result, then I'd say the bracha over the primary and not over the secondary food. Now, the Gemara here does not talk about where I'm eating two different foods together as part of a mixture or something like that. This is where things start to get a little bit more complicated. So first of all,
you're having herring kiddush with crackers.
Yes.
You want to eat the herring. You eat crackers because it modifies the saltiness.
Yes.
And then you want to have some crackers afterwards by itself. So once you say shakol, that includes the mazonot.
Okay, we'll get to that. We'll get to that. The question was asked about eating herring and crackers together, shakol, mazonot, which is ikar, which is tafel. We'll get to that soon. If I don't answer it, then call me out on it again. Okay. But let's just build it up one by one. So first of all, if you just go back to page 249 for a moment, page 249, source number 24 in the Yalkut Yosef, and he says the following. He says, a person who eats cooked dish, rice, for example, why does he write shelo b'toch ha'seudah? Meaning there was no hamotzi lechem in Arabs. This is without bread. So you've got your rice or your cooked vegetable, whatever it may be, and together with that you've got your chicken or your schnitzel or basar or your meat on your plate. So ima basar me'ulav ima oles gam kshe'oklo levado eino mevarech al basar. If the meat is mixed up together with the rice, right, you have pieces of, strips of meat or salami, whatever it is, that's part of the rice. So it's one dish. So then you would not say a separate bracha because that is going to be shutafel legabe ha'oros. אבל אם הבשר מונח בנפרד בצד הצלחת, ואוכלו בפני עצמו בלי העוץ, right? But you have meat on one side of your plate and you have rice on one side of your plate. There are different dishes. They're on the same plate. You're eating them together, but they're different dishes. Then he says, מברך על הבשר, בין אם אוכלו בסוף, בין אם אוכלו באמצע, over the page, whichever one you start with, it doesn't matter. You still say the bracha. ובפרט אם הבשר העוף נתפשלו בקדרה אחת, והעורס בקדרה אחרת, or the more so, if they were cooked in separate pots. If it's all eaten together, that's something else. In other words, the point is, you have one, just because I'm eating, I have one plate, and I have different foods that I'm eating together. If each one is a separate food, so each one necessitates its own bracha. This is not the case of the Ikar v'Tafel. What is the case which is clear that is the case of Ikar v'Tafel? So one more case which is clear, and then a few cases which are not so clear. But again, where you have foods that are mixed together, certainly if they were cooked together, where it is one entity, where the different parts cannot be separated, are not distinct from one another, that would be a case that is considered one thing. And then we'd say the bracha over the Ikar, and we not say the bracha over the Tafel. So I have a cake which has different ingredients in it. It's got flour, it's got other things, whatever it is, but it's one thing. It's one cake. I'm going to say the bracha over, generally speaking, over flour. If I have, let's say, pastry, right, or barekas or something, you have a potato bareka which has got pastry on the outside and it's got potato filling on the inside. It's all one thing. It's one entity. There, we'd say bracha, one bracha on the Ikar, not bracha on Tafel. Okay, one moment. That is those cases are more or less straightforward. Where it becomes more complicated, and which is a big machloket, is where I have a mixture. I have two different entities. Okay, first of all, if they aren't cooked together, it already starts to get a bit more complicated. But where each one is distinct by itself. I go back to the example of fruit salad, the classic case, where I have different pieces of fruit, right? It's all one entity, it's all one thing, where I bring the bowl to the table, and you'll say, what have I got? You won't say, I have a pot of strawberries and bananas and or whatever. You say, it's a fruit salad. Okay, but within the fruit salad, you have apples, which are borei pri ha'etz, and you have pineapples, which are borei pri ha'adama. Do I look at this as one entity and say I have to now determine which is Ikar, which is the primary food, and only say the bracha on that? Or do I say, no, they're two separate things, and since each one is distinct and it's large pieces, I have to say two brachot? So that is a machloket. That is a machloket between the Mishnah Berurah and the Chayei Adam, whether we view that as one entity, and I only say Ikar, or I view it as two. And many poskim say the best thing to do in such cases is to take one piece of borei pri ha'etz and one piece of borei pri ha'adama, take them out separately and say those two brachot. If it's a case where everything has been crushed up together, or it's very small, it's not distinct. I go back to the example of, let's say, the rice and the almonds, right? I don't have to now sit there, start sifting through and taking out, the piece of almond from the rice to say, no. There, it's much clearer that it's one food, and I say the bracha over that which is primary, which is the Ikar, and not over the Tafel.
Yeah, is there a subjective element to the top of the Ikar? I'm thinking particularly of chinuch for children and grandchildren. You give them a piece of cake which has got raisins or chocolate chip cookies in it, and they will meticulously pick out each raisin or chocolate chip before eating the rest of the cake. What does that say to them?
Right. So the question was, is there a subjective element to this? Where so if there is a case where the example was given, you have a cake with the chocolate chips or raisins or whatever it is, and a child, but it could be an adult, picks out meticulously. I guess in the case of the chocolate chip, they pick out the chocolate chip to eat, and in the case of the raisins, they pick it out not to eat. Right? Maybe that's okay. So the case if they pick it out not to eat, that's easier. There's no question. But yes, there would be, if a person, there is definitely a subjective element to this. If a person is interested particularly in, eating the chocolate by itself, and they're picking it out, then that would be its own food, and that would be a bracha, right? How do we determine? So in these cases where, say, I only say the bracha over the Ikar and not over the Tafel, how do I determine which is the Ikar and which is the Tafel? So there are two primary rules which we go by here. One is, generally speaking, we'll say it's the majority food. Right? So they go back to the example of rice and almonds, because it's an easy example. The rice is the majority, and that would be, the bracha would be borei minei mezonot versus the bracha on the almonds. However, if one of the foods is a borei minei mezonot, one of the 5 grains. Now, I just mentioned rice. Rice is an exception when it comes to the bracha of borei minei mezonot. Although rice is not one of the 5 grains, the bracha beforehand is still borei minei mezonot, but the bracha afterwards on rice is actually borei nefashot. So rice is its own category, and that's something else. We'll leave it out of the discussion for now. But if you have one of the 5 grains, so you have pastry, you have something else, you have a mezonot element, even if that is not the majority, so long as that is an integral part of the food. It's there for the taste. It's there that a person is interested in eating it. Then that would be considered automatically the Ikar. So you have a pastry which has got meat inside, which has got potatoes inside, which has got whatever you want inside, but the pastry is there. It's part of the part of what I'm eating, and that would be the bracha would be borei minei mezonot. The exception to where mezonot is not going to be the Ikar is in one of 2 scenarios. Either where it's there not necessarily for the taste, but it's a very, very minor element. So we mentioned last time, you have meatballs or something like that, where you have a little bit of breadcrumbs or flour, which is added just to sort of bind it together, but it's not there, right? The person doesn't think they're eating, balls of breadcrumbs. They're eating meatballs, but it just happens to have a few breadcrumbs. That's not the main. There, it would not be the main element. Also, schnitzel was a bit of a discussion where the breadcrumbs are just used as a coating. Okay, so that's something else. We would generally say that is not the Ikar. And the other case is where the mezonot is there, not as a part of the. It sounds a little bit funny to say, but it's not really there used as part of the food. We'll come back to your crackers in a moment. It's not just but it's there sort of as a base for the food. So the poskim talk about you have an ice cream cone, where a person, it's not that the person is interested in eating the cone necessarily, but the cone is just there as a way of holding the ice cream, right? Or you have different types of biscuits and things where you have a mezonot base, and then you have the flavoring or the filling, whatever it is on top. So in such cases whereby a person is not really interested in eating the mezonot, they're just interested in having it as a base, then the other food could be the Ikar. So that's the case over there. So the poskim talk about, I know it's the wrong time of year, but the poskim talk about cheesecake, right? What would be where you have what? Never the wrong time of year for cheesecake. Okay. I take that back. All right. So where you have, there is a mezonot element, there's sort of a crust or pie or biscuit part of it, as well as the cheese part, right? Which is the Ikar and which is the Tafel. So if it is, I'm not an expert on cheesecakes, but I understand there are different ways of there are different ways of making and baking, etc. If everything was baked together, and therefore you have one component is, and you're interested in eating both, then the mezonot is going to be the Ikar, and that would be the bracha. If it's the type of food where it was not all baked together, but it was just and the mezonot really is used sort of as a base, sort of holding it in place, then so long as you're interested in eating both, you would actually say 2 brachot there, which is similar to the case of the ice cream cone, whereby you would say shakol on the ice cream and you'd say mezonot on the cone itself. As I said, this is where a case where it's not all baked together or it's not cooked together, but it's you have these 2 foods and they are somewhat distinct from one another, and therefore there would be 2 brachot. If the case is that a person is not really interested in the mezonot part, the crust, whatever, one's only interested in the cheese, in the filling, and one's here it's subjective. One views that mezonot element just as something to hold it together, but not something that one really wants to eat. So then the bracha would only be shakol. So going back to the case of crackers. So this we discussed last week as well. If there is a cracker which really has no flavor and a person has no interest in eating it, but it's only there, this was the case that we saw was the Trumat Hadeshin, I think, who said that that one would only say the bracha on the food which is eaten on top of it. And then we saw that the Shulchan Aruch said, or the Magen Avraham said that nowadays our crackers are not like that. Our crackers have got taste, and generally speaking, a person eats them because you're interested in eating the cracker as well. So if you have a cracker which has got a spread on top, meaning it's all eaten together, so then the cracker would be, in this case, would be the Ikar, and you'd say borei minei mezonot, and you'd not have to say a shakol on the cream cheese or the butter or jam or whatever it may be. But if they are 2 separate foods, like you have a cracker and you have the herring, or you have whatever else, a piece of meat or a piece of chicken or anything else which you eat on top of the cracker, then best thing to do is say a borei minei mezonot on the cracker first, say a shakol on the other food, and then even when you eat them together, because they are still two distinct foods. What about another question which doesn't come up in the book, but the poskim discuss? What about sushi? What bracha would one say on sushi? Here it gets really complicated. Chazal did not eat sushi. Otherwise, there'd be a whole 3-page discussion in the Gemara about it. Because you have on the one hand, for those who may not be aware, so sushi is you have rice. It's all encased together in seaweed. It's wrapped up in seaweed, but you have rice inside, and inside there is a filling. Sometimes it can be fish, sometimes vegetables, maybe both. So it's all one mixture, it's one entity, right? The only people who take a piece of sushi and start picking it apart are people that are worried about which is the Ikar, which is the Tafel, and are trying to get the brachot right. But normal people just pick up a piece of sushi and eat it in one. So yeah, which is the Ikar and which is the Tafel? What would be the bracha? So on the one hand, the rice is clearly the majority element. This is not the usual case where I say where mezonot takes precedence because it's rice. Rice is different to other mezonot, but the rice is the majority element. However, when you have fish, you have salmon or tuna, whatever fish you may have inside. Clearly, the tuna is the fish is going to be more important and adds flavor. It's going to be so. There are many poskim who say that in the case of sushi, one would say borei minei mezonot on the rice and would say shakol on the fish, right? Because it's not clear that one really trumps the other one in terms of the rules of Ikar and Tafel. The rules of Ikar and Tafel do play a case here because the seaweed, for example, everybody says you would not say a separate bracha on the seaweed, which is on the outside. That would be Tafel to the rice. The vegetables as well would probably be Tafel to the rice, so you'd not be required to say a separate bracha. If it's a case where, again, different ways of making sushi, but if it's a case where often you have the fish inside, it's a large piece of fish, and again, it's distinct by itself. You could have it. If it's very, very small pieces and it's not in and of itself distinct, then borei minei mezonot would suffice over the whole thing. Now there are poskim who say you should only say borei minei mezonot because that's really the ikar, and that would be sufficient. As I say, the best thing to do borei minei mezonot if something else, which is the shakol, and then you're covered from both. What?
It's easier to say shehakol.
It's easier to say shehakol, but if the rice is the ikar and that is borei minei mezonot, then it would be incorrect to skip over that.
Another Chinese food, chon.
Chon?
What would you say about chon? You have barley, you have meat, you have potatoes, it's all commission.
Right.
It's all one commission.
Right. So cholent is also an interesting discussion, which the poskim talk about. Again, it's going to depend how it is. So based on what we've said, if you have barley or other food which is mezonot, which is inside the cholent, that is going to be the primary. It's certainly there for flavor. It's part of the food. That is the primary. We think that would be the bracha. If you have small piece, it's already one mixture, and the other foods are not distinct in and of themselves, so then mezonot would satisfy. If there are large pieces of meat and large pieces of potatoes, which is often the case, so then we go back to the machloket we saw between the Mishnah Berurah and the Chayei Adam, which would say that you have large pieces of food which are distinct in and of themselves. Then there is large grounds to say that each one would necessitate its own bracha. So the best thing to do would be again to isolate. Yeah.
What category is rice?
Rice. So rice is, generally speaking, we say borei minei mezonot is one of the 5 grains. Right? Wheat, barley, rye, spelt, and oats, which are that's what? Rye, yeah, not rice, not. I'm getting to it. So that is where we say borei minei mezonot. So we would have thought that rice would not be included. Rice is different. There's actually a machloket in the Gemara, but it's because in the times of Chazal was a very staple food. Still is a staple food in many parts of the world. That it was given the significance of the bracha of borei minei mezonot, but it doesn't have. But that is only the bracha beforehand, not the bracha afterwards. So other foods of the 5 grains, we say borei minei mezonot before, we say ala michya afterwards. Rice is the only food you would say borei minei mezonot beforehand, and you would say borei nefashot afterwards. So all the other dinim that we have in terms of mezonot taking precedence, etc., that applies to the other mezonot foods, does not apply to rice. So rice we treat as anything else, it just happens to be a borei minei mezonot before. That is that's the difference. Okay, so if you go to page 265, just maybe a piece of machshava behind this idea of Ikar and Tafel, which we've been talking about for a long time. There's a quote here from the Mesilat Yesharim talking about the traits of Chassidut, page 265, right at the end. The Mesilat Yesharim talks about, he says, what is Chassidut, piety? He says, many people think that this is about doing all sorts of actions that make no sense necessarily. He says, if you look, for example, the fourth line, source number 49, he says, all sorts of self-affliction and sorts of things which people think, this is what they thought in his day. I'm not sure how many people think this nowadays, but they would go and they would roll around in the ice and in the snow, and they would whip themselves, and they would say all sorts of confessions and things, all sorts of external actions which a person would take to try and become pious. And he says the last few lines in bold, he says, he says that's not really what makes a person a chassid. Again, chassid here in the sense of pious, not chassid in the sense of the Baal Shem Tov, that came later. But he says, really, you should know these are external practices, which when a person has reached this level of piety, these are things which help you, these things which may assist you, but this is not the main focus of it. So there's in a shir which is published on the Yeshiva website, source number 50, he says, how is this related to our topic? He says, this is really one of the great efforts that a person has to work on throughout their life, is separating Ikar and Tafel, that which is primary and that which is secondary, not just when it comes to our brachot. He says, if one is unable to make this distinction, we can become easily confused. Sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's not so clear. What is Ikar and what is Tafel? He's talking about general life. This is talking about the conceptual underpinning behind the idea of Ikar and Tafel, because it relates. I have things I have to do, but I push them off, I procrastinate. Who knows what that is, right? Then I'm not distinguishing between that which is primary, that which is secondary. Tafel, lav dafkara, that which is tafel, not necessarily bad. But if it comes in place, it comes at the expense of that which should be primary, that is something negative. Okay, and he goes on and discusses how important the idea of the current Tafel is in Avodat Hashem in general. So it's maybe something just to think about when we're spending so much time talking about what is Ikar and Tafel and our brachot. Should help get us into the mindset of being able to distinguish what is primary and what is secondary in life as well, not just in terms of the food that we eat. Okay, so another related topic, which this we'll finish off, related to Ikar v'Tafel, somehow related to brachot, is the order in which we say our brachot. So if you go back to page 253, we have mentioned some of this before, but we'll go into a little bit more detail. That when we have separate foods, right? It's not Ikar and Tafel, but I have separate foods. Each one necessitates its own bracha. Which bracha comes first? Mention the case of fruit salad, right? I have a number of different fruits in front of me. Which fruit should I pick up to say the bracha? Should I say the bracha on the apple or on the pomegranate or on the date? Right? We're coming up to Rosh Hashanah, not that far away. I mean to scare you, but it's not that far away. So we have the simanim, we have the apples, we have the dates, etc. Which one do we pick up first? It's always machloket. You start with the apples, or you start with the dates. So what does it depend on? So over here, source number 28 from page 253, Mishnah Masechet Brachot. Yulafanav minin arbe. A person had many types of food in front of them. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, im yesh benehem min shiv'a alav u'mevalech. V'chachamim omrim mevalech al eze men sheyiltzeh. So we're talking about where we have fruits. Okay, at this point, it's not yet clear whether they have the same bracha or they have different brachot. But the Mishnah says, so you have a number of different fruits in front of you, the apples and the dates. Let's just use that as an easy example. Rabbi Yehuda says, one of them is from the min shiv'ah, from the 7 species of which Eretz Yisrael is praised, right? Wheat, barley, grapes, figs, dates, pomegranates. if it's from one of those species, that would take precedence. Therefore, you would say the bracha on the dates rather than the apples. That's Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. Huh?
The dates on the apple is the same.
The date, right? It's the same bracha, but which one would you? In Shivadif, Rabbanan Savri min Chavivadif. Rabbi Yehuda holds that that one which comes from the 7 species takes precedence, and Chachamim hold the one which you prefer would take precedence. But if the bracha is not the same, in that case you would go back and you would say both brachot. So who do we paskin like? Do we hold like Rabbi Yehuda, who says that you go by the min shiv'ah? Or do we hold like Chachamim, who says you go by the min chaviv, the one which you prefer, even if it's not from those 7 species? So says the Rashba, on top of page 254, source 29, says says the Rashba over here, we actually follow Rabbi Yehuda, even though he's Yachid. Versus Rabbim, the reason is because later on in the Gemara it seems to imply that the halacha goes like Rabbi Yehuda, and therefore you would say the bracha over the date, even if you prefer the apples. That's how the Rashba holds. The Rambam disagrees. Rambam in source number 30, he says, so you have many foods in front of you, they all have the same bracha which applies to them, so therefore you only say the bracha once. If they have different brachot, you'd be required to say the separate brachot for each. Says the Rambam, whichever one you want to pick up first, that is the bracha you would say. Meaning, if you don't prefer one type over the other, then you go by the one which is from the 7 species. But says the Rambam, unlike Rashba, who said you always go like Rabbi Yehuda, you always take the one from Min Shiva. Says the Rambam, that's only if I don't have a preference. But if I have a preference, I really, really like apples more than I like dates. So according to the Rambam, I'd say the bracha over the apples. Tosfot seems to seems to say the same things. The chaviv lo ve'achar kach yavrecha lasheni. Okay, and let's see this.
Did bracha on the apple. You like the apple.
Yes.
You don't make another one for the date.
If it's a date, if it's the same bracha, then that's correct. But if you have an apple and a pineapple, for example, so you'd say the bracha on that, and we'll see in a moment what happens if it's different bracha. So says the Shulchan Aruch of source number 33, right? Because clearly we're talking about 2 different cases. One case is where I have 2 foods in front of me, which both have the same bracha, right? The apple and the dates, and then the question is just which one do I say the bracha on first? But then when I take a bite of the second one, I don't say the bracha again. When we do the simanim on Rosh Hashanah, whatever your custom is, whether you start with the dates or whether you start with the apple, you'll say the Brei Priya Eitz at the beginning, and then when you move on to the apple or the dates, depending on whichever one you started with, you don't say the bracha Borei Pri Ha'etz again. That's correct. But the nafka mina is, which one do you start with? The other case would be, now the question is, do I extend it when the Rambam says, whichever one is chaviv, whichever one I like more, that is the one I say the bracha on first. So if I'm eating now not apples and dates, but I'm eating apples and pineapples, so apple is Borei Pri Ha'etz, pineapple is Borei Pri Ha'adama. So now which one do I start with? I have to say two brachot. We've said previously that generally speaking, Borei Pri Ha'etz is a more specific bracha, and generally the more specific brachot come first. So I would think that I say Borei Pri Ha'etz first on the apple, and then Borei Pri Ha'adama over the pineapple. But what if I like pineapples much more than I like apples? Would this then apply as well? And would I switch the order over there? So the Rosh over here in source number 32, sorry, was it the Rosh or was it over here or was it a bit later on? No, it comes up a little bit later. Okay, we'll come back to that case. Let's see the Shulchan Aruch first. Shulchan Aruch in source number 33. He says, one had many different types of fruit in front of them. If they have the same bracha, and one of them is from the 7 species. That one would come first, even though I prefer the other type of food that is like the Rashba, that is like Rabbi Yehuda Nigma. One of them is not from the 7 species, so then whichever one I prefer. Now, if they don't have the same bracha, even if one of them is from the 7 species, so he says, yeah, whichever one I want to eat first, I can have that that can come first. And he says, so whichever one, so he seems to extend it, the case of what the Rambam was saying, that whichever one of the species I prefer, I could say that one first, even if they've got separate brachot. So the Shulchan, that was what we just saw, source number 33, that was the Shulchan Aruch, Reish Yud Aleph, that was Seif Aleph. Again, so he says, where you have 2 foods that have got the same bracha, the one which is min shiva, which is of the 7 species, that comes first. Now you'll see over the page, in source number 35, at the bottom, Hiari quotes the Rambam. He says, La Rambam, ben shiva kodem shavot, ben she'enam shavot, ben she'esh b'hem min shiva, ben she'en b'hem min shiva, makdima chaviv lo az b'ota sha'a. So now he quotes the Rambam, who says that even if one of them was from the Shivat Aminim, nonetheless, I still say the bracha which I want, of the food which I want first. So according to the Rambam, what comes out is like this. According to the Rambam on Rosh Hashanah, if I really prefer apples to dates, I'm going to say my bracha on the apples, I'm going to have the apple first, and only afterwards the dates. According to the Rashba, and according to really the Shulchan Aruch, what seems to be, because he first quotes this as the general opinion, and only afterwards he brings the Rambam, it would seem to be that that you should say the bracha over that which is from the Shiva Minim, which is why you should say the bracha over the dates first. But we can understand now why there are many people who have the custom that they would say the bracha over the apple. That is based on the Rambam, which is brought to Shulchan Aruch. That is, if it is really chaviv, it is much more you prefer eating it, then there is grounds for that. But generally speaking, one should rather say the bracha over that which is from the Shivat HaMinim first. Okay, we'll just say quickly. What about the case where there are two separate brachot? Which comes first? Adama or Eitz. As we said, generally speaking, and the implication, I'm not going to read it inside now, but the implication of the Gemara in source number 38 is that Ha'etz comes before Ha'adama. The question would only be if a person has 2 fruits in front of them, and I actually prefer that which is Ha'adama over that which is Ha'etz. Do I have am I allowed to take that one first and say the bracha of Borei Pri Ha'adama, or do I first have to eat the one which is Borei Pri Ha'etz? So here the Rosh, in source number 39, it's at the bottom of page 258. He says, He says, generally speaking, we say that Borei Priya Eitz is more significant, it's more specific, because the Borei Priya Adama kolel kol hagader ba'adama, aval Borei Priya Eitz mevalech dafka ma shegadar beilan. Right? Borei Priya Adama includes anything which grew from the ground, whereas Borei Priya Eitz includes only that which grew from a tree. And as we've said before, a tree ultimately grows from the ground, which is why if a person made a mistake and a person said Borei Priya Adama over something which should have been Borei Priya Eitz, you are b'di'evet yatzat yedei chova. You have fulfilled your obligation because that is included. The other way around would not be the case. Something which I should have said Borei Priya Adama and I accidentally said Borei Priya Eitz, I have to go back and say Borei Priya Adama again. So therefore, he says, nonetheless, at the top of page 259, it says Yesh lomar Delo chashiv kol kach birkat Borei Priya Eitz keneged birkat Borei Priya Adama kmo shechashuva birkat Borei Priya Adama al she'akol. Right? If, for example, between Shehakol and Borei Priya Adama, there is no question that Borei Priya Adama comes first, because Borei Priya Adama is much more specific than the bracha of Shehakol. But Borei Priya Adama and Borei Priya Eitz are quite similar. At the end of the day, both of them are for fruits. There's not as much of a gap between the two, and therefore he says that in a situation whereby I have two fruits and one of them is much more chaviv than the other, I would be allowed to say Borei Priya Adama before Borei Priya Eitz. And that is what the Shulchan Aruch here in source number 41, he summarizes like this. Haviu lefanav davar shebirkato Borei Priya Eitz v'davar shebirkato she'akol. Borei Priya Eitz kodemet. Right? I have an apple and a piece of chocolate, so I have to say the bracha Borei Priya Eitz on the apple first. That comes before she'akol. She chashuva she'ena poteret ela davar echad. That only applies to one thing, it applies to fruits. Where she'akol is a very, very general bracha, which applies to everything that's left. V'chein Borei Priya Adama b'she'akol. Same thing. If one is Borei Priya Adama and she'akol, I have to say Borei Priya Adama first. However, says in the next paragraph, Im eviu lefanav Borei Priya Eitz or Borei Priya Adama. You have two fruits. One is Borei Priya Eitz, one is Borei Priya Adama. Ez mem she'etzeh kodem. Whichever one I prefer, that I can take first. And there are those who say that one has to have Borei Priya Eitz kodem. If you like them both equally, or you're not sure, whatever it is. So the default is Borei Priya Eitz should come first. But if you very much prefer one over the other, then you could say the whichever bracha first. So just to summarize, what we said is like this: when I have two fruits which are the same bracha, I have two fruits which are both Borei Priya Eitz. We saw machloket in the Mishnah between Rabbi Dan Chachamim. Do I say the bracha over that which is from the Shivat HaMinim, or do I say the bracha over that which I prefer? That extends, that is a machloket in the Rishonim as well. The Rambam says you go by that which you prefer. The Rashba says you go by that which is from the Shivat HaMinim. Says the Shulchan Aruch, really you should say the one over the Shivat HaMinim first. But the Shulchan Aruch does also bring the opinion of the Rambam to say that if one is much more chaviv, you really prefer the other one, then we have grounds to say that you could say that bracha first. If the two fruits are different brachot, okay, so one is Borei Priya Eitz and one is Borei Priya Adama, so generally speaking, one should say Borei Priya Eitz first. However, if one really, really likes the food which is Borei Priya Adama more than the one which is Borei Priya Eitz, then one is allowed to say the Borei Priya Adama first. Of course, one should have in mind that the Borei Priya Adama is only for that food, and one should still say the Borei Priya Eitz on the other food as well. Just mention, we went to see it inside, but when it comes to what if you have two different fruits of the Shivat HaMinim, right? Which one takes? So you have dates and figs or grapes. Which one takes precedence? Like we have in our Tu B'Shvat Seder. If you remember, you have all the different fruits there. Which one do you say the bracha on first? So the order there goes by the pasuk. We have this is the Gemara in source number 42 tells us that based on the pasuk that says Eretz Chita Usara, etc., and then you go by the order. The pasuk actually mentions the word Eretz twice, and we go by whichever one of those species is closer to the word Eretz. Then that is the one which comes first. So you can see the order of priority essentially at page 262 is in terms of the fruits. Olives comes first, and then you have dates, grapes, figs, pomegranates. Okay, so Adkan, we'll stop there for today. Hopefully we have a little bit more clarity in terms of that which is Ikar and that which is Tafel in terms of which brachot to say. As I say, these are complicated. I'm not pretending that they're easy. But Adkan, we have finished volume 14 of Tzurba Rabbanan. Thank you everybody for coming. As I say, next week probably we'll talk about Chut Bein HaMetzarim, and let you know about what material we'll be using, and we'll carry on from there.
לא התפתחות האלה, אנחנו מחפשים את הכלל,
Yes.
כי זה העיקר, אבל צריך לעשות קידום.